Welcome to Death Trip, where nightmares come alive and fear knows no limits. We journey into the darkest corners of the human soul, where the line between reality and the supernatural blurs. Here, each story is a chilling adventure that will grip your mind and twist your heart. Whether you're a thrill seeker or a believer in the unknown, Death Trip is your ultimate destination for terror. Buckle up. You're in for the ride of your life. The final notification. It started with a simple notification. Mira sat alone in her dimly lit apartment, scrolling through her phone aimlessly. It had been a long day, and the quiet hum of the city outside was almost comforting. But then, her phone buzzed, a sharp vibration that cut through the silence. She glanced at the screen. You have 1 hour left. Her heart skipped. Was it some kind of joke? A weird app notification? Maybe a glitch? Mira unlocked her phone, but nothing else appeared. She dismissed it, laughing nervously at herself. But before she could put the phone down, it buzzed again. 59 minutes remaining. Her fingers froze over the screen. The time had changed. The countdown was real. A cold sweat broke out on her skin. Was this some kind of prank? She quickly checked her apps, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Just as she was about to close the phone, another notification appeared. Don't try to run. Her breath caught in her throat. Instinctively, Mira stood up, the phone still in her hand, and moved toward the window. She looked out at the empty street below, searching for something, anything that might explain what was happening. Was someone watching her? Her building was quiet, not a sound from her neighbors. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. The phone buzzed again. They're already outside. Mira's hands trembled. She dashed to the front door, double-checking the lock. She pressed her ear to the door, listening for any signs of movement in the hallway. Silence. 56 minutes remaining. Panic set in. Mira rushed back to her living room, dialing a number on her phone. She called her friend, Lisa. The ringing felt endless, each tone stretching her nerves tighter. Finally, the call connected. "Lisa, I need help," she blurted out. "Something's wrong. I keep getting these weird notifications. It's counting down, and it's..." Before she could finish, the line cut off with a cold, mechanical click. The phone buzzed again. "No one can help you now." Mira dropped the phone, the screen facing up. The minutes were ticking away faster now, or maybe it just felt that way. She grabbed her jacket and threw open her apartment door, bolting down the hallway toward the elevator. But when she reached the elevator, the doors wouldn't open. The buttons were dead. She turned toward the stairwell. Each step echoed in the stairwell's emptiness as she ran, her breathing growing more ragged. She reached the ground floor and burst out into the street, her chest heaving as she looked around. The street was deserted. Mira's phone buzzed again in her pocket, but she didn't want to look at it. She was too afraid of what it would say. But then another notification came, followed by another, and another. The buzzing was relentless. She couldn't take it anymore. She pulled out her phone, her fingers shaking as she unlocked it. The screen lit up, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. 10 minutes remaining. Her eyes darted around. There was no one. The streetlights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows on the empty road. The air felt colder now, heavier, pressing down on her as if something was drawing closer, invisible but inevitable. 5 minutes remaining. Mira ran. She didn't know where to go, but her instincts screamed at her to move, to get as far away as possible. Her legs burned as she sprinted through the dark streets, her phone buzzing constantly in her hand. 3 minutes remaining. She turned a corner, her lungs on fire, her vision blurring from exhaustion and fear. But no matter how far she ran, the feeling remained. She was being watched, hunted. The seconds were slipping away. 1 minute remaining. Mira collapsed against a brick wall in a narrow alleyway, gasping for breath. She looked at her phone one last time. The final notification had appeared. It's here. The air around her stilled. A shadow crept along the walls, growing darker, more solid, as it twisted toward her. Mira's heart pounded as she backed up against the wall, her phone slipping from her hand and shattering on the ground. She never had time to scream. Mira's phone lay shattered on the pavement, its screen flickering with the last remnants of the countdown before going completely dark. The alley around her was thick with silence, broken only by the sound of her ragged breaths. Her vision was swimming with spots from exhaustion, but something much darker was closing in. The shadow. It moved in the periphery, creeping along the edges of the walls like smoke, warping the shapes of the alley. But it wasn't just darkness. It had weight. Mira could feel it pressing against her skin, an unnatural cold that made her chest tighten. Instinctively, she scrambled backward, her hand brushing over her broken phone, as if it mattered now. Her pulse roared in her ears, drowning out the faint buzzing of the streetlights overhead, which flickered in time with her heartbeat. The shadow twisted and turned, forming vague outlines, fingers, hands, something resembling a face. But every time she blinked, the shapes dissolved, becoming more abstract, more alien. It was like the darkness itself was watching her, reaching for her. Mira tried to scream, but her throat constricted, as if the very air was being pulled from her lungs. Her body felt paralyzed, pinned by the invisible weight of whatever was coming for her. Then she heard it. A whisper. No, not a whisper, but something close, like the sound of air slipping through a crack, a soft, eerie hiss that vibrated through the alley. The sound wasn't human, and it wasn't coming from behind her. It was right in front of her, from the shadow. It spoke without words, crawling inside her mind, coiling around her thoughts like a predator. And then, through the silence, the message became clear. I see you. Her heart dropped. She tried to move, tried to run, but her legs were frozen in place, and the shadow was closing in fast. Every breath she took was harder than the last. Her vision blurred. It felt like her body was giving up on her, like something was pulling the life out of her. Just when it seemed like the darkness would swallow her whole, something strange happened. The streetlights flickered once more, but this time, the shadows shrank. The suffocating cold that had wrapped itself around her body lessened, retreating slowly. The air was still thick and oppressive, but the crushing weight lifted just enough for Mira to move. She didn't question it. Using every ounce of strength she had left, she bolted out of the alley. She didn't look back. She didn't care what it was or why it had come after her. She only knew she had to get away. Mira stumbled through the dark streets, her limbs aching, her lungs burning. The world around her seemed distorted, stretched, like she was running through some warped dream. She couldn't tell where she was anymore. But one thing was clear. The further she got from the alley, the weaker the pull of the shadow became. But then, her phone rang. Her broken, shattered phone, the one she'd left behind. She stopped in her tracks, frozen in terror. The sound echoed through the empty street, an impossible noise that sent chills down her spine. The ringing grew louder, more insistent, and it wasn't just any ringtone. It was her own voice, repeating one word over and over: run. The sound was deafening now, growing louder until it felt like it was reverberating inside her skull. She clapped her hands over her ears, but it didn't stop the noise. It wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was in her head. Then, the world shifted. The shadows pooled together at the edges of her vision, converging into a single point in the distance. From that point, a figure emerged. It was tall, its body elongated and shifting, as if made of the very darkness it had commanded. It didn't walk. It glided toward her, moving impossibly fast, despite the slow, deliberate motion of its steps. Mira's body seized with terror. The figure was drawing closer, and with it came the same suffocating cold, the weight of the shadow pressing down on her chest. The ringing in her ears stopped abruptly, replaced by a single, low voice. "There's no escape." Mira backed up, her legs shaking, her mind racing for an answer. Any answer. She felt cornered, hopeless. But then something strange happened. A single thought pierced through the fog of her panic. This isn't real. The moment the thought entered her mind, the world around her wavered. The streetlights flickered violently, the shadows rippled, and the figure paused in its approach. For the first time since the notifications began, Mira felt a sliver of control. "This isn't real." She said the words aloud, and the figure stopped entirely. The cold began to lift, the shadows receding, and the oppressive weight pressing on her chest finally lessened. She took a deep breath, her body shaking but alive. Mira sat there, her body trembling, her mind trying to process what had just happened. The empty street stretched out in front of her, still, silent, and utterly devoid of life. There were no footsteps, no cars, no sounds of distant voices. It was as if the world had been stripped down to nothing, a cold, hollow void. She slowly rose to her feet, every muscle aching as if she'd run a marathon. Her heart was still pounding, her breath shallow. She checked her phone again. No new notifications, no countdown. Just a dead screen reflecting her pale, terrified face. But she knew this wasn't over. The figure's final words echoed in her mind, chilling her more than the cold night air ever could. "But I am." Her surroundings may have returned to normal, but the sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond her sight, remained. That creeping presence, it hadn't left, and it was closer than she dared imagine. Mira stumbled forward, determined to get home. She needed to lock her doors, draw the blinds, and find some sense of safety. But as she walked, the streetlights flickered again, casting fleeting shadows that danced at the edges of her vision. She kept telling herself it was just her imagination, that whatever happened back in the alley was some bizarre hallucination or nightmare. But each step felt heavier, each breath harder to draw. The darkness seemed denser than it should be. And then, it happened again. Her phone buzzed. She froze, staring down at it in her hand. The screen, which had been dark moments before, lit up with a single message. Her stomach twisted as she read it. "Look up." Mira's blood turned to ice. Every fiber of her being screamed at her not to obey, not to look. But her body moved against her will, as if the very command had taken hold of her muscles. Slowly, she lifted her head. At first, there was nothing, just the empty street stretching out into the distance. The buildings were lifeless, their windows blackened, and then she saw it. The figure, standing at the far end of the road, barely visible beneath the last flickering streetlight. Tall, thin, its body shifting unnaturally, as if it wasn't fully part of this world. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a blank, hollow void. No eyes, no mouth, just emptiness. And yet, it was staring at her. Mira's legs felt weak. She wanted to run, but her body was rooted to the spot. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching her. The longer she looked, the more the air seemed to thicken around her, as if the very fabric of reality was being pulled apart. Her phone buzzed again. "Run." She didn't need to be told twice. Her feet moved before her mind could catch up, and she bolted down the street away from the figure, her heart slamming against her ribs. The cold night air whipped past her, but no matter how fast she ran, she could feel it. The presence. It was following her. She didn't dare look back. Her surroundings blurred as she sprinted down alleyways, through narrow streets, her vision swimming with panic and exhaustion. Every shadow seemed to move. Every corner hid something sinister. The world around her no longer felt solid. It was as if the city had become some twisted, ever-changing maze, trapping her deeper with every turn. And then, just when she thought she couldn't run any further, she burst into a familiar street. Home. Her apartment building stood tall in front of her, an old, crumbling structure that now felt like the only sanctuary she had. Without hesitation, she ran inside, slamming the door behind her and racing up the stairs. Her lungs burned, her legs screamed in protest, but she didn't stop until she reached her floor. She fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking uncontrollably, before finally shoving the door open and locking herself inside. The familiar confines of her small apartment were a relief, but the sense of safety was fleeting. She knew it wasn't enough. Not against it. Mira collapsed onto the couch, gasping for air. She sat there in the dark, her heart racing, trying to convince herself that she had escaped, that whatever was out there couldn't reach her here. But then, her phone buzzed again. This time, she didn't want to look. She didn't want to see what it had to say. But her hand moved on its own, picking up the phone, her fingers trembling as she unlocked the screen. A single notification appeared. "Let me in." Her heart stopped. She stood staring at the words, her mind racing. No, this wasn't possible. It couldn't be. She was safe. The door was locked. The windows were closed. There was no way it could get inside. The phone buzzed again, the notification changing. "Let me in, Mira." The room suddenly felt too small. The walls were closing in. Her chest tightened as the fear clawed at her throat. She dropped the phone and backed away, her gaze locked on the door. And then, a knock. Once, twice, slow, deliberate. Someone, or something, was standing on the other side of the door. Her phone buzzed again. "It's already inside." The knock came again, louder this time, reverberating through the tiny apartment. Mira's body went cold as she backed into the far corner of the room. She couldn't move. She couldn't think. The door creaked open, and the darkness stepped inside.